Welcome back to our Balance of Power Generation training video series. So far, we've covered capacity versus energy. We've talked about environmental, and we've talked about new technology. And in this session, we're going to be discussing regional transmission organizations, or RTOs, or the markets as sometimes they are referred to. I'm joined with Andrew Lachowski once again. Welcome back, Andrew. Glad to have you here. So let's begin with a general overview of RTOs. And so how long have RTOs existed?
The origin of the regional transmission organizations really is with the federal regulator of electric utilities. That's Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And us in the industry, we refer to that as FERC. So FERC issued an order in 1999 that really created and incented organizations like us to join the regional transmission organizations. And the reason was they were trying to make sure that there was fair and open access to transmission grid. So the electric utility industry, and particularly the transmission lines, distribution lines, it's kind of a natural monopoly. You know, you don't want your when you drive home, you don't want distribution lines to be on both sides of the street. You would like there to be one company that serves you. Same way with all the higher voltage transmission lines. You don't want to see them all over the countryside. So it's kind of, again, this natural monopoly. That to make sure that in our area, Entergy has really the majority of the transmission lines, and to make sure that Entergy treats us fairly as one of the customers, it takes regulation. So the regulators form these regional transmission organizations, and really to oversee the bulk transmission grid. So when we need something, we don't go to Entergy, we go to our RTO, which in this case, in the 2/3 of Eastern Arkansas is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO. That's the regional transmission organization for the 2/3 of the eastern part of Arkansas. And in the western part of Arkansas, we have the Southwest Power Pool it serves as the regional transmission organization. And these really are regional in that they're large multi-state organizations. So we just happen to be one of the states that has 2 RTOs that we have to deal with, but MISO extends all the way up Manitoba, even in Canada, all the way down to the Gulf Coast, to New Orleans. And then Southwest Power Pool, similarly, they go from North Dakota and Montana all the way down to New Mexico and parts of Texas and Northeast Louisiana. So it's really a large regional footprint with the independent system operators. And then there's regional transmission organizations. There's 5 others in the country. The northeast part of the U.S. has them, California has them, and then the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, is a regional transmission organization. And then there are still areas in the country that don't have RTOs. Much of the West doesn't function with an RTO, and then the Southeast U.S., it does not have an RTO. So it's not like every utility has to belong to an RTO. It's more of there's incentives for organizations like us to join.
What I heard you say was, I guess, 1990s is when they were formed by what FERC put together, FERC 888, Order 888. And so they've been around for a long time. And we participate in 2 RTOs, one of those being Southwest Power Pool, or SPP, and then Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO. And so as I mentioned in the introduction, we sometimes refer to SPP and MISO as markets. Now, you mentioned a lot about transmission and access to transmission and not duplicating transmission, but why do we refer to them as markets?
So in addition to some of the basic functions that they have about fair and open transmission grid and ensuring that, they also operate a power market. And so we offer all of our generation into this market, and then all of our energy needs are also bid into the market. So we offer all the generation, and all of the energy that our members use is served from the market. And really, it's separate. They're kind of separate. And so the market, SPP and MISO, becomes the clearing point. They're not certainly going to, they take in all of the money from the load, they pay the generators. And so they are that market function. And the reason they've developed into markets is to try to optimize the transmission system. So similar to a highway, there's a limited amount of cars that could go on the highway. Well, there's a limited amount of electricity that can go on any of these large transmission lines. So the market is set up to optimize the generation to serve energy needs in the most economical way by optimizing use of the transmission system.
So they're still focused on transmission, and it's really just optimizing what's connected to that transmission system, both generation and load, I'm assuming, to maintain reliability and maintain low cost. And so it sounds simple enough. I mean, you're offering all of your generation into the market to sell it basically, and you're buying all of your load from the market. So kind of sounds like trading stocks on the stock market. Is that not the case? I mean, is that what it's like?
Quite a bit different than the stock market. So electricity is real time. And so there has to be this balance in real time between the generation placed on the grid and the energy that's pulled from the grid. And so it has to be almost balanced perfectly every second of every day, 24/7. And furthermore, I would just add, electricity is so essential to our lives. And so it's not pork bellies traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange.
Or whatever, yeah.
People can do without bacon, they can't do without electricity. So it really is very essential that with reliability. And part of that nature of that is that we are highly regulated. And while we call it a market, there's really parameters around what we can do. So let's talk about offering our plants. We really have to offer our plants at what the cost is. And then if the market picks it up, we do get paid at the incremental value. So there's times where we can earn more than what our cost is, but we're ensured that if we get picked up and our plants perform, that we at least get our cost. And then of course the load's paying all of that on the other side as well. So it's, I will just repeat, it's essential. And so it's not this, people can do without. There's a recognition that we have to do it in an economic way that benefits the public, really.
And just to expand on a little bit about what you said, I mean, in some ways, it is similar to a trading market in that, as demand goes up, that price goes up. If there's a demand for a stock, the price can go up. But what is different, it's still regulated, and you have a market monitor. Mm-hmm. No one tells you what the price of some stock, whether that's pick one, Amazon or something else. They don't say, hey, here's the cap on it. We would somewhat have a cap, is what I understand, because it's essential services. Right? It's a lot of trading, a lot of activity, a lot of cost that goes through there. And if you go back to what you said, that these RTOs are primarily focused on transmission. They've created this market because of how they were positioned, really as an opportunity for a clearinghouse. I guess, because we sell everything in, we've got an opportunity to make money on what we generate. We can buy our loads. We got an opportunity maybe to buy that at an economical price. How has that benefited our members? Or a better question is, how have the RTOs or the markets benefited the members of AECC?
And it comes back to the ability of the large regional footprint to optimize across that large regional footprint. Prior to the market, we were very often on the phone with our neighbor utilities saying, do you have something cheaper than what we can generate it? And that was really what our dispatchers were doing all day, was just on the phone. Is there any opportunities to sell or any opportunities to purchase? So it was a real bilateral market. Now it's just really, again, optimized over the large region. And so that's how it has benefited us, at least from the energy side.
And you and I both are electrical engineers, and I can remember in school when you would do generation dispatch, and for those that are maybe watching or listening to this, you kind of stacked it up. You'd say, here's this lowest cost, you'd put it on the bottom, you'd always want to run that. And it was those small amount of hours that you really wanted to run those top plants, because that was what was driving your high cost. So this is maybe help that out, I guess, is what you want to say. The markets put that on a bigger scale. The idea was, hey, we can really lower this. And the other thing from a generation planning standpoint, we always had to have this planning reserve margin. I think we talked about that in our first episode, really talking about capacity and energy. But you always have to have enough resource online to cover the loss of a resource, so that you always have that high reliability. And so I think when you think about that, that was one of the maybe the benefits of the market. Have you seen that play out with this concept? You said optimize, lowest cost, optimizing efficient use of resource. Have you really seen the RTOs get us to that point where it's optimized?
For a time, we were seeing the planning reserve margin decrease because of this broader footprint. And just to maybe repeat what the planning reserve margin is you have your peak demand out there, and the planning reserve margin is above and beyond that peak demand to ensure that should there be generation outages, should the loads exceed what you expect them to be, that there's some margin to make sure that the system remains reliable. So that's what that planning reserve margin is. It's above and beyond what that peak demand is.
And we had that before. I mean, before the markets, we still had that, right?
Absolutely.
Right. And what was our typical planning reserve margin if you go back before we were in MISO and SPP?
Well, and we've been in SPP forever. It's
right, that's true. That's true. They haven't had the same, I guess, control. But if you go back to when you mentioned you're on the phone all the time doing bilateral contracts, what were we using for our reserve?
Our target was 17% at that point in time.
And how does that compare to where both markets are today?
So SPP for a long time went down to 12%, and they even indicated, we may be able to go down lower. Now, what happened was Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott, there were outages. Most recently, Winter Storm Jerry was causing issues. So there became some recognition that there must be something wrong with this planning reserve margin and how low it is if we're finding ourselves with reliability issues. So both of them, both MISO and SPP, have gone back and reevaluated. Some of it was accreditation of resources. Some of it was, do we have the right planning reserve margin? And both of them, while they've maintained the summer planning reserve margin similar as to what they've had, SPP has even increased it slightly. They have made some significant increases recently with the winter planning reserve margin. And that impacts us quite a bit because we have had winter peaks recently with the storms that I just mentioned. So we've had higher demand in the winters than we have seen in the summers. So we're now in a position where we're having to go out and build extra when under the old model, we may not have even had to. Right. The non-RTO, and there's strong penalties if you don't have the amount of resources needed to meet that planning reserve margin.
So these RTOs, I mean, so it's normal utility practice to have a planning reserve margin. We had that before. And now an SPP or MISO can change that, as you just mentioned, and change it somewhat drastically, where, like you say, in the winter, we're almost double what would have been our normal planning reserve margin. Is there any way to control that? Do they just get to make those decisions? I mean, what is their process for setting that? Do they ask stakeholders like us, and then do we have a voice in that process?
We do have a voice. They do ask. They don't necessarily have to listen to the stakeholders. SPP is better at listening to the stakeholders than MISO is. Eventually, they file it at FERC, back to the federal regulator, and we can intervene at FERC and make our arguments there as well. So, and have done so, and currently are doing so in some cases where we might have some disagreements with them. But they do have an independent board, independent from their stakeholders. So in the end, the staffs of MISO and SPP can go to their independent boards and get decisions out of them.
And I think it's one of those, where you look at it, I get why what you just described, Winter Storm Uri and Elliott and Jerry, and this influx of intermittent resource that basically increases the risk of loss of load, which is kind of where they drive that planning reserve margin. So, I appreciate going kind of into that and kind of where they're at. But let's take a step back and go, you mentioned that RTOs really have or what was a primary function for the RTOs while they were developed was transmission planning. And so can you tell me a little bit about how that transmission planning function works?
I guess there's two pieces of transmission planning. There's the local planning to make sure. So if you had, if we saw that some of our transmission lines were being overloaded, there's too much load, additional load growth has caused there to be additional needs with regard to the transmission we have. That's more local, and that's kind of remained with the utilities. We still have to bring those forward to SPP and MISO to get approvals, but it still remains, if it's local. But then there's the regional transmission. So think in terms of anybody who's driven out in western Kansas knows there's a lot of new wind out in that area, western Oklahoma as well. SPP does the more regional planning to say, oh, we need transmission lines to go from the western area where there's all these wind farms over closer to the eastern edge where there's more of their power demands. So they do that type of transmission planning. Same with MISO. MISO is going to be doing the larger transmission lines across the region that would be planning for that.
Yeah, and so I guess kind of a last question with that, we talked about how the planning reserve margin ultimately requires us to maybe add more generation to meet that. How do these transmission planning initiatives, and I know MISO, I was just talking to one of the MISO representatives a while ago, and they're looking at Tranche 3 down in here in the southern United States, but how do these transmission expansion projects within a MISO or an SPP, how does that impact our members' rates?
And that's one thing that we have definitely seen after joining the RTOs or the SPP becoming an RTO is with this added transmission, it has impacted our transmission costs. So on the SPP, for example, the higher voltage transmission is shared among the whole footprint. So there may be transmission lines in the western part of their footprint that we may not benefit from, but we do get to help pay for it. So that is part of the overall deal of being part of that group.
Yeah, and I think, I know this was a balance of power, and we're talking about power, and here we are stepping off in transmission, but it's important to understand because what I heard today was RTOs, regional transmission organizations, primary function was to allow access to transmission and to somewhat plan across a larger region so as to optimize the build of that transmission. But then it relates to generation because you have to have the transmission to get from the generation back to the load. And so they look at new load, they look at new generation, begin to plan out resources, ultimately with a desire to lower the cost to the consumer. But I think while there's been some good in the markets, again, we have an opportunity to sell all of our generation into that market. We've seen kind of the bad side, which is it's increasing our requirements for more energy on the system because of their planning reserve margin. And to some degree, it's not necessarily optimized the way that we thought it would be. So is that a pretty good summary from your standpoint of what an RTO is and kind of how it impacts us?
I certainly agree. I may add that one of the reasons we're seeing this planning reserve margin increase is because we've seen a transition in our generation fleet. So think in terms of 20 years ago when SPP became a RTO, and it was actually in 2004, coal was kind of the main resource that we all leaned on. Well, coal has a supply of fuel right there on site, 50 days in the coal pile. We've transitioned to rely more on natural gas, which does not have, in many cases, any backup fuel on site. So we're leaning on the gas industry to be reliable, and there's been some issues with that. We're also leaning more on wind and solar. And wind and solar is great energy resource, but it isn't always there when we need it. So to the degree that they get accredited, which they do for some capacity, there are these periods where you still have to have that dispatchable resource. That's what's kind of driving up the need for the planning reserve margin to be higher.
Well, I've got a loaded question for you.
All right.
And, I think both MISO and SPP would say their mission is to maintain or improve the reliability of the system and really drive down costs. So they want to be low cost. This is kind of a two-part question. Do you see them succeeding in that mission? Do you believe in general the regional costs are being driven down? And do you believe that AECC's costs in particular have gone down? So if it's lower cost and more reliable, do you believe our system is lower cost and more reliable because of joining the RTOs in 2013 and 2014?
It's tough to say. I definitely think there's been benefits with lower energy costs through the optimization. The reliability issues, we were having to curtail firm load during Winter Storm Uri, and that is such a unwanted step to have to take. And so it shows something was broken, and it's hard not to look to maybe some of what has happened with the RTOs and the region and the thought that the market will provide when the market didn't provide. To MISO and SPP's credit, they are trying to take actionable steps to improve that. but that's going to come with added costs too. So it's hard to say overall whether it has truly benefited us or not.
Well, great chatting with you today. I kind of want to summarize what we talked about. From what I gathered, RTOs kind of have a myriad of functions, including regional planning, reliability oversight, market facilitation. As a member of SPP and MISO, we must coordinate with them on new generation and load, so it's both sides of the equation. And we must have enough generation capacity above our load, that planning reserve margin, in order to participate in the markets. And when we do participate in the markets, just like you said, we sell all of our generation into that market and we buy all of our load from that market. And what I also heard you say is that RTOs are evolving basically under this flood. You just mentioned it. Back in 2004 is mainly driven by coal, and now there's a large influx of renewables and other non-dispatchable resources. So they're evolving and understanding what that looks like and how they optimize that under this new concept. And then finally, while the thought of an RTO was an attractive, concept for us to consider, because, hey, we can lower the planning reserve margin, we can benefit from the regional connectiveness of that system, the jury's still out on whether or not it's actually saving us money and providing us with the benefit that we expected. So with that, is there anything else you'd like to add about RTOs before we close out our session today?
Wow, you have summarized it really well, Jonathan. But I will say one thing for anybody who doesn't have awareness, that Little Rock, when we're here in Little Rock today at our headquarters, is really an electric utility hub. SPP, Southwest Power Pool, has their headquarters across town here with 700 employees. And then MISO, they have their regional headquarters here in Little Rock as well. So it's for their southern area, the part of MISO that would include Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas has their headquarters here. So we're really fortunate to have the folks with the RTOs just right across town.
We can go bend their ear anytime.
That's right. And we certainly do, don't we?
That's right. Well, Andrew, thank you.
Thank you.